Welcome to another big train tour at the Colorado Railroad Museum. This episode, we'll be taking a look at a diesel locomotive placed in service in the early 1960s, Denver and Rio Grande Western number 3011. Intended to pull freight trains through the Rockies, not around them, this Electro-Motive-built diesel served the Rio Grande and its successor into the 1990s, well after the railroad was merged into the Southern Pacific Railroad. Today, this pioneering Model GP30 diesel locomotive is proudly displayed at the museum, serving as a reminder of 1960s innovation from Colorado's not-too-distant past. Hi, I'm Paul Hammond, Executive Director of the Colorado Railroad Museum. In the early 1960s, our subject, Big Train, helped usher in railroading's second generation of diesel locomotives here in the Centennial State. Although its entire service life was spent with just a single owner, Denver and Rio Grande Western, and successor Southern Pacific, locomotive number 3011 served the state's largest railroad faithfully for more than 3 decades. Let's step back in time now and examine the history of this pioneering diesel-electric locomotive. The Denver and Rio Grande Western's primary challenge, as well as its marketing focus, was always its spectacular mountainous terrain. Its slogan of "Through the Rockies, not around them" was reflected in its steep grades and in turn by locomotives that were built for this kind of railroading. The railroad's heritage, first its expanding narrow gauge network, then the conversion of its Denver to Salt Lake City main line to standard gauge in 1890, led to an ongoing need for ever more powerful locomotives throughout the early decades of the 20th century. As the United States geared up for World War II, American railroads faced unprecedented demands. Western lines struggled mightily to accommodate massive traffic surges in support of the Pacific Theater campaigns. The Santa Fe Railway especially needed new diesel locomotives to supplement steam engines on its arid southwestern routes. The rigorous wartime service that followed removed any lingering doubts about the superiority of diesels over steam. Railroads poured millions of dollars into improvements after World War II, including the purchase of thousands of new locomotives. Capital improvements to American railroads more than doubled between 1945 and 1949, and investments in motive power more than tripled during the same period. Most of the money went into new diesel-electric locomotives, not steam. Largely in response to the competitive challenge posed by newcomer Electro-Motive, longtime steam locomotive builders Alco and Baldwin developed diesel passenger, freight, and switching locomotive prototypes in the 1930s. As the post-war race to dieselize began, 2 additional competitors emerged to supplement these big 3 of diesel locomotion. Longtime railroad industry supplier Fairbanks Morse entered the diesel locomotive business as the war was winding down, and the nation's 3rd largest steam locomotive builder, Lima, teamed up with an experienced diesel engine manufacturer in 1947 to become Lima Hamilton. When the Rio Grande first began adding diesel locomotives to its fleet in 1941, the most popular models, such as Electro-Motive's FT streamlined freight locomotives, possessed limited horsepower. More individual diesel locomotives units were therefore required to take the place of the steam locomotives they replaced. But of course, a single locomotive crew could operate as many diesels as were needed to pull the trains, since unlike steam locomotives, the diesels were equipped with multiple unit control systems. Thus, the change from steam to diesel locomotion still made economic sense because of greatly reduced labor, maintenance, and mechanical facility costs. The Rio Grande's early diesel locomotive fleet included switchers from a variety of builders, including Alco and Fairbanks Morse, even a half-dozen stylish but unfortunately unreliable Alco Model PA and PB passenger locomotives. For the most part, however, the Denver and Rio Grande Western was a steady purchaser of General Motors diesels from builder Electro-Motive. Among the more notable deliveries were dozens of Model F3, F7, and F9 streamlined diesel-electric locomotives, added to the company's roster starting in 1946. These would pull Rio Grande passenger trains, as they were modernized and dieselized post-war, including the proud California Zephyr passenger train, which debuted in 1949. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, the Denver and Rio Grande Western steadily acquired new diesel-electric locomotives, completely replacing steam on its standard gauge routes by 1956. This wasn't unusual. All of America's railroads were phasing out steam throughout the 1950s, and the initial rush to dieselize was over in about a decade. By the late 1950s, Fairbanks Morse, Baldwin, and Lima Hamilton ceased building diesel locomotives and exited the marketplace altogether. America's major railroads were now completely dieselized, and the quest for new diesels to replace older units would become more competitive going forward. Interestingly, as steam locomotives vanished in the U.S., General Electric began producing mainline diesel-electric locomotives starting in the late 1950s. Back in the early decades of the 20th century, GE had been involved in building the very earliest diesel-powered motor cars and locomotives in the U.S. Until the 1950s, however, GE had itself constructed only smaller industrial and switching locomotives, along with building electrical equipment for installation in other builders' locomotives. As the 1960s dawned, General Electric's unexpected entry into the diesel marketplace meant that General Motors' Electro-Motive division finally had serious competition. The year 1962 was a prosperous one for the Denver and Rio Grande Western. Coal was the single largest commodity, accounting for over 30% of all car loadings. The railroad was projecting 1 million tons of new traffic that year from its just completed Cane Creek branch. The railroad also had just signed a contract with Public Service Company of Colorado, increasing coal tonnage 100,000 tons every year over the next 9 years, until a standing order of 1 million tons annually was reached. Much of this coal was feeding an expanding network of electric power generating plants, not only in Colorado, but also throughout the West, in turn helping supply electricity to meet the demands of a growing post-war baby boomer economy. To help move all of this anticipated tonnage, new locomotives would be necessary to supplement the railroad's existing fleet of diesel-electric motive power. At that time, the Denver and Rio Grande Western was primarily interested in 4-axle locomotives for freight service. Although General Electric's newly introduced Model U-25B met that requirement, while offering the highest horsepower available at the time for a 4-axle road freight locomotive, the U-25B was still relatively unproven in service. Locomotive builder Alco simply didn't offer anything equivalent. This left Electro-Motive as the likely supplier. Perhaps coincidentally, in fall 1961, the company's very first Model GP30 locomotive rolled off the production line in LaGrange, Illinois. The GP30 was developed as a direct response to the competition posed by General Electric and its U-25B model. Both of these locomotive models would launch what is today known as railroading's second generation of motive power. GE's 2,500 horsepower Model U-25B had been introduced in 1959 and was being successfully demonstrated on American railroads. The U-25B offered improvements to mechanical and electrical systems, along with 500 horsepower more than Electro-Motive's most powerful and modern 4-axle freight locomotive at the time, the Model GP20. In a very real sense, General Electric entered the locomotive market and started what would not only become a horsepower race, but also an ongoing march towards making significant technological advances. Diesel locomotives prior to this time had not focused much on innovative engineering and pushing horsepower boundaries. Responding to GE's competitive advances, Electro-Motive launched into the development of what would become the GP30. The frame and trucks or wheel sets from its earlier model, the GP20, were used to simplify the development process. A mechanically assisted turbocharger was added to the GP20's V16 Model 567D diesel engine, increasing its output by 250 horsepower. The locomotive's car body was sealed, with the central air intake using filtration to cut down on dust and dirt incursion, and thus reducing overall maintenance. All of these improvements required more space, But rather than lengthening the frame, Electro-Motive decided instead to raise the height of the locomotive's car body. This extra height provided space behind the cab for electrical equipment, the turbocharger, and the unit's central air system. EMD's automotive stylists were brought in to create the GP30's distinctive profile, which features a bulge above the cab, extending back about 2/3 of the car body. This prominent bulge also sticks out horizontally and would become unique to the GP30. Thus, when the Denver and Rio Grande Western placed its order for GP30s, it entered the second generation of diesel locomotives. A key attribute of the new locomotives was the fact their engines were turbocharged. With the less dense air available at higher elevations along the Rio Grande system, non-turbocharged locomotives experienced a greater power loss, while the turbocharged engines maintained nearly the same power output at any altitude. This was an important consideration for a railroad which ran through the Rockies, not around them. At the time the GP30s were delivered, the only other turbocharged locomotives on the railroad's roster were a small number of Alco PA and PB passenger units, along with several Alco switchers and road switchers, plus 3 experimental diesel hydraulic locomotives built in Germany. These last, delivered to the Rio Grande in 1961, would quickly be deemed unsuitable and sold to Southern Pacific Railroad just 3 years later. Our subject locomotive, Denver and Rio Grande Western No. 3011, was delivered in May 1962 from builder Electro-Motive. No. 3011 was part of an order for 13 of the builder's model GP30 diesel electrics, introduced just a year earlier. To help finance its $2.7 million purchase of new GP30s, the Rio Grande traded in 13 older model FTA and B locomotives to EMD. The Rio Grande would become one of the first railroads in the U.S. to order this new model, which proved to be popular with railroad companies. Nearly 950 GP30s were constructed during a short 28-month production run. EMD aggressively marketed its new model, even engaging General Motors illustrators to create a series of unique illustrations showing GP30s operating on U.S. railroads. Placed in service immediately by the Denver and Rio Grande Western, and assigned road numbers 3001 through 3013, the new locomotives quickly proved their utility. A second order was placed for 15 more, and by February 1963, the railroad had 28 of these powerful new second-generation Jeeps in service. The primary difference between the two orders was that the fireman's side of the cab was slightly longer on the later 15 units ordered, allowing for one more crew member seat in the locomotive cab. The GP30 was not just popular with the Rio Grande. Many Class I railroads in the U.S. ordered GP30s, and a number of smaller railroads followed suit. The largest purchasers were the Southern Railway, Union Pacific, Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, and Baltimore and Ohio. The Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy was also a fairly large purchaser of the GP30, and as a result, this locomotive model was well represented among the major railroads serving Colorado. The Denver and Rio Grande's GP30 locomotives were assigned to a wide variety of services, and as it turned out, they would have lengthy careers with the railroad. They could be occasionally found filling in for the usual streamlined F units, pulling the ski train to Witter Park and back. Even more rarely, they might be called to take the place of the graceful, streamlined F unit diesels, pulling the railroad's flagship California Zephyr passenger train. They could also be found pulling heavy coal trains when needed. But the GP30s were most likely to be seen hauling the short, fast freight trains that the Rio Grande was known for. At first, they appeared in pure groupings, something that makes sense given they were the railroad's newest and most powerful freight locomotives. Delivered with Nathan Model M3 horns, the locomotives also featured distinctive locomotive nose-mounted dual rotating Mars lights. Interestingly, pilot plows, which were standard on most Rio Grande locomotives, were not included at first. These would be added starting in late 1964, with most of the GP30 fleet equipped by 1970. When they were introduced, the GP30s debuted a new version of the tried-and-true black and orange speed lettering paint scheme that the Rio Grande had used since the 1940s. Much more noticeably, These were also the railroad's first freight locomotives delivered with low, short hoods. The railroad's previous road switchers, such as Electro-Motive models GP and SD7 and 9, and Alco model RS3, all featured high hoods which restricted crew member visibility. This helped make the new GP30s stand out in service. There were other subtle differences between the first and second orders of these locomotives. GP30s numbers 3001 through 3013 weighed 257,508 pounds, while numbers 3014 through 3028 weighed just under 3,000 pounds more. The weight difference was primarily attributed to the slightly larger cab installed on the second order of these locomotives. The Denver and Rio Grande Western's 1963 annual report proudly featured its new GP30 locomotives on the cover, reinforcing the idea that these locomotives were popular with both management and train crews. That same year, the Rio Grande also acquired and placed in service 25 new 70-ton trailer flat cars for carrying truck trailers, 100 new 50-ton bulkhead flat cars, 200 cushion underframe box cars, with 100 of these considered high-density 100-ton capacity and the other 100 cars rated for 70-ton loadings, 60 89-foot-long flat cars, plus 56 40-foot highway trailers, the vast majority of which were insulated and refrigerated. Since steam locomotives had vanished completely from the railroad's standard gauge lines, a completely new diesel locomotive running repair shop along with related stores department facilities was nearing completion at the Rio Grande's Burnham Shops facility in downtown Denver. The 1963 annual report stated, "These facilities have been designed to provide a coordinated operation between supply and diesel locomotive servicing and repair, and they have been integrated with the existing locomotive heavy repair shop." A major feature was the installation of an underfloor wheel lathe, the first of its kind on any U.S. railroad, which trues the wheels of diesel units without having to remove the wheels from the diesel locomotives to turn them, the annual report proudly stated. That same annual report also noted that 10 new Electro-Motive model GP35 diesel locomotives were on order, with delivery anticipated in 1964. Thus, for only a few short months would the GP30s reign as the most modern and powerful locomotives on the railroad. Based largely on the Rio Grande's experience with the GP30s, however, the railroad would never again purchase locomotives from any other builder except Electro-Motive. Because of the Rio Grande's close partnership with the Burlington, the new GP30s could be found in run-through service all the way to the outskirts of Chicago in the 1960s. Starting in 1964, GP30s began showing up in mixed motive power combinations all across the Rio Grande system, still powering fast freights and other priority trains. Throughout the 1960s, they were joined increasingly by Electro-Motive's latest models, including 4-axle GP35s and GP40s, and 6-axle SD45s, as new orders were received by the Rio Grande. Starting in 1972, the Denver and Rio Grande Western began acquiring 3,000 horsepower 6-axle model SD40 T-2 tunnel motor locomotives. Featuring enhanced engine air cooling systems, these locomotives would become ubiquitous in pulling heavy freight trains across the system. But even so, GP30s continued to be mixed in on occasion, making for unique consists in photographs taken in the 1970s and 1980s especially. That same year of 1972, the Federal Railroad Administration mandated chemical retention toilets in locomotives. Prior to that time, diesel road locomotives were typically equipped with what were known as direct dump toilets. With this directive, the Denver Rio Grande Western decided to downgrade or even retire a number of its older locomotives. The GP30 fleet, coming up on 10 years of age, saw locomotives 3001 through 3019 upgraded with the new toilets. However, for whatever reason, GP30's numbers 3020 through 3028 were downgraded. This meant they lost their train service radios, speed recorders, toilets, and cab awnings. With the changes, these 9 locomotives were no longer qualified to serve as lead units in a locomotive consist, essentially becoming non-control or B units. In an interesting twist that shows the worth of the GP30s, however, the Rio Grande at this same time downgraded all of its newer GP35s and even some of its newer GP40s into B units. Over the years, a number of GP30s were involved in wrecks. Just 5 years after it was placed in service, in 1968, Locomotive 3003 was wrecked on the east side of Soldier Summit, Utah. Less than 6 months later, 2 more GP30s were wrecked on the Craig branch. All 3 damaged units were sent to Electro-Motive for rebuilding and placed back in service a few months later. As other locomotives were rebuilt after wrecks, a new paint scheme was typically applied, featuring billboard lettering with a much larger Rio Grande name featured on the locomotive sides. In later years, several GP30s were simply retired after serious wrecks. Locomotive number 3011 does have one unique claim to fame. Along with GP35 number 3032, it was given a temporary paint scheme, black with orange lettering, for the fictional Sierra Pacific Railroad and used in the filming of the 1973 made-for-TV movie Runaway. Rio Grande GP40 number 3081 was also painted, but in silver with red lettering, and did the honors of capturing the runaway train, itself led by number 3011, in this B-grade, long-forgotten television movie. Later years saw GP30s serving all across the system. When the Ridgeway branch, which had once connected to the Rio Grande Southern and also served the mining town of Ouray, was on the verge of abandonment in 1976, GP30s were captured on film pulling some of the last trains. GP30s also found a new home in the 1970s, replacing older 4-axle Electro-Motive Jeeps on the steep grades of the Monarch branch. This unique line, converted in the late 1950s from narrow gauge, showcased grades of up to 4.5% and required 2 switchbacks to reach the limestone quarries that supplied the furnaces of Colorado Fuel and Iron in Pueblo. As the Rio Grande's GP30s celebrated 20 years of service in the early 1980s, these trusty workhorses could still be found in a variety of service assignments. They called frequently on branch lines in Utah, and saw duty as yard switchers and in work train service across the system. In 1988, the Denver and Rio Grande Western acquired Southern Pacific, with the SP name surviving as the dominant brand. The GP30s would roll on during these interesting years, occasionally venturing to locations far from their home states of Colorado and Utah. But all good things must come to an end. Starting in 1993, 30 years after their delivery, the Southern Pacific began retiring GP30s. Our subject locomotive, number 3011, was itself retired at the end of 1994. During the early to mid-1990s, many other former Rio Grande GP30s found new homes throughout the Midwest and southeastern U.S. 6 of the trusty second-generation pioneers even continued in service through Southern Pacific's merger with the Union Pacific Railroad in 1996. Just 3 years after that, the last former Rio Grande GP30 was stricken from the UP locomotive roster. An era had finally come to an end for this enduring locomotive model. Following its retirement and sale to Omnitrax, GP30 number 3011 ended up stored in Wichita, Kansas. Apparently never operated, the locomotive was moved to Loveland, Colorado in 2000, then donated by Omnitrax 2 years later to the Colorado Railroad Museum. Lacking a track connection and short on standard gauge trackage at the time, the museum asked nearby Coors Brewery to store the locomotive, which it graciously agreed to do until transportation could be arranged for the short move to the museum's nearby campus. As it turned out, the donation of a second locomotive to the museum would finally create the needed catalyst. Coors plant switcher number 988, which traced its roots back to 1938 and the now vanished Rock Island Railroad, had just been retired following an accident. Coors graciously offered this iconic locomotive, and trucking was arranged for its final move to the Colorado Railroad Museum's property, along with former Denver and Rio Grande Western GP30 number 3011. The move of switcher 988 was fairly straightforward, but the 3011 required quite a bit more work on account of its weight. The locomotive had to be lifted off its trucks or wheel sets, with one end placed on the rear end of a specially prepared tractor-trailer rig, and the other end on its own freely swiveling dolly. August 11, 2004 dawned warm and clear, and the move was on. After navigating the short trip over nearby streets, the locomotive was moved onto the museum property and unloaded. After all this activity, the locomotive sat quietly, eventually being tucked away beside the museum roundhouse. It was obvious the locomotive had been painted just once in its lifetime, at builder Electro-Motive's factory in 1962. And although that in itself was unique from a preservation standpoint, its nearly 60-year-old paint was too far gone to conserve, and simply put, it was looking shabby. The unit lacked windows and letterboards and other accoutrements as well. Overall, the locomotive resembled a hulk. Something needed to be done to correct the situation. In 2021, number 3011 was moved to a more prominent location near the museum roundhouse. Work began on scoping a cosmetic overhaul. Estimates were sought from contractors to prep and paint the locomotive, and work began on sourcing letterboards, window glass, and rubber gasket materials necessary to install these items. In August 2022, work began on giving number 3011 its second ever paint job, with this work completed in early September. Letterboards and cab windows and more have followed in the months since. The results have been spectacular, bringing this 60-year-old pioneering diesel back to life visually. The Colorado Railroad Museum's collection of historic diesel-electric locomotives is richer because of the presence of a GP30. Today, Denver and Rio Grande Western number 3011 is proudly displayed at the museum, helping to showcase the competition and innovation of American locomotive builders in the late 1950s and 1960s, and the second generation of diesel-electric units that were spawned in the process. Even today, the railroad industry still benefits from these innovative and increasingly more powerful locomotives that, starting in the 1950s and early 1960s, were first introduced in the U.S. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed our tour of GP30 number 3011 and the Denver and Rio Grande Western's quest, starting in the 1960s, for new and more powerful locomotives to pull the railroad's famous fast freight trains through the Rockies, not around them. I also hope that your appreciation for Colorado's rich railroad heritage continues to grow with each and every tour of the museum's collections.
Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Commenting and sharing in particular may qualify as virtual engagements for important funding programs like the SCFD.